Friends. That behind me is an old, authentic, restored Land Rover, which is a pretty rare sight in Slovakia. So much so that when I first saw it on this sort of MTB circuit of mine, which is about 20 kilometers in the small mountains behind my house, I saw it as a sign. You see, I had a 1/35th scale Land Rover kit in the stash for quite a while, and since I had it, I knew exactly what kind of diorama I want to do for it. So when I saw that beauty over there, I knew it was time to get this build going, so let's check it out. This is another kit from AK Interactive, and I gotta say they've been crushing it with these civilian subjects. The pancake train I did earlier this year was one of the most fun projects of my life. This kit is pretty extensive, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was made for AK by MiniArt. The rubber tires are a bummer though, but I think we'll make them work. I just realized that this is already my 4th car model. The first one was the Volkswagen Beetle, which was super fun. Then there was the Land Cruiser, which also comes from AK, but that one was noticeably simplified compared to this one, but also much easier to assemble. And the last one was the Chevy Army truck from MiniArt, and this model reminds me of that one a lot. I also realized that I don't know how to film these car builds because like 90% of the time I'm just cleaning up parts and gluing them together. But hey, this little hack with diluted putty is pretty sweet. Basically, you grab a bit of Tamiya putty, thin it down with Mr. Leveling Thinner, apply it as a thick wash around all these glued joints, and then wipe off the excess with MLT again. Once you start painting, it'll be a pleasure to apply pin washes to these areas. The rest of the build is standard, I'd say. There's some very nice photo edge, including authentic Land Rover logos, and the chassis is a slog, just like with the Chevy. This is where I like to add a little bit of texture with Tamiya putty mixed with Mr. Cement S. Car frames are not made from armored steel, but it's nice to have at least a bit of contrast between the individual components and different materials. The chassis contains probably more than half of the kit's parts, and although a part of me wants to skip most of them because nobody's gonna ever see them, the other part tells me that there's a small chance that, when you skip half of these parts, it'll show on the finished model. I mean, I like to improve and modify, especially when the techniques are quick, but even the exhaust muffler has a hole that doesn't have to be drilled out. Well, at least the wheels are gonna keep us busy. The seam line in the tread needs to be removed, and that's not always easy or completely possible. Well, this is the only trick I know, and it works well enough. Not great, but not terrible either. I just made sure the tires will stay in place with a bit of superglue around the rim. This might also ensure that no aggressive thinners will get inside the wheel. It was a huge relief getting this whole section of the model finished. And guess how much of it will be visible? 0.000, but that's totally cool. I made a small mistake somewhere along the road because the flatbed didn't want to sit nicely on the chassis, and even then I was left with this ugly gap. I didn't line up the flatbed with the sides properly, and this was the result. But fear not, after some aggressive detail removal, I built up the lost elevation with a strip of evergreen styrene and flooded the whole area with black superglue. Debonder lets you get rid of the excess CA, and it almost feels like you're blending enamel or oil paints. You can get these VMS glues and debonders directly from the manufacturer or Michigan Toy Soldier, and you can also get a small discount if you use my promo codes. Links are down in the description. The missing details were then scratch built from evergreen strips, and this is also where the provided photo edge parts truly spice up the model. I noticed some additional parts in my reference image, such as these large handles which I tried to build from scratch, but the result was not good. Instead, I designed them in 3D and printed them along with these hooks and toe shackles, but I bought those for a few bucks on Colts 3D. This is a much prettier result, and it actually leads me to the next very important part, the towing crane. AK was smart enough to not include some half-measured plastic rope and instead advises us to use some fine string. Well, I have something better. an actual metal rope twisted from 0.2mm copper wires. It's more difficult to work with compared to a soft shrink, but it's more realistic and much easier to paint. The entire crane was a super fiddly job, but here you can also see where I used those 3D printed hooks and shackles. All based on my reference image of the real vehicle, which also served as inspiration for the box art. Okay, let me show you a really cool trick on the seats. Remember how I sculpted them from epoxy putty on the Chevy truck? Well, turns out that in some Land Rovers, the seats are pretty smooth and almost glossy. Made from that fake leather or something. But the point is, I didn't have to add those intricate folds, wrinkles or any of that. All they needed were some delicate seam lines. So after I rounded up the edges with a sanding sponge, I scraped the seams with a razor blade, which makes it easier to make a straight line, and then I simply enlarged them with a sharp hobby blade. This also allowed me to get rid of any sharp edges, creating a more natural look. By the way, if you didn't know this about Mr. Cement S, you're missing out, because it's excellent for smoothing out pretty much anything. If you have some fuzzy edges on your model, just hit them with the stuff and it's gonna look great. Apart from that, the interior was again about gluing pieces together, but it also had a few ejector pin marks. I like filling these with black superglue, and when the working conditions are too tight for sanding, a curved hobby blade will do the job. And just to be on the safe side, it's good to hit these areas with a very fine sanding sponge or fiberglass pencil. The resulting surface will be super smooth. Okay, the outside of the cabin is more interesting because this is where most modifications take place. I'm not an expert on Land Rovers because I'm more of a Jeep guy, so it's hard for me to tell which of these are garage modifications and which one were done in the factory, but we're talking about modifications of the kit itself. However, these were very easy and clean, and again, if you like to do a bit of scratch building every now and then, I highly recommend these strips from Evergreen because they'll save you a ton of time. I was able to upgrade this whole area with strips, apart from the large sign on the roof, which was cut from a plastic sheet. But do you want to know the sad part? I can't even show you the assembled model in its raw state because it just keeps falling apart. So let's jump over to the painting workbench where the real fun begins. The first business is the interior, and let me do a little magic trick here. I know I've done this on the pancake train, and it's because the interior is a pretty tight space, but also because every technique I used here will be demonstrated on the outside of the car, and then some. Not much of this will be visible, so I kept the techniques pretty basic, but it was fun, and I spent about 8 hours with it. I also like to use the interior as a proving ground for different techniques, so I can see what's gonna work best. But before we start painting, we need to add the windshields and mask them off. Luckily, there's enough tolerance between the glass and the frame, so they fit without any issues, even when there's a layer of primer and several paints on top of the plastic. My techniques are still very primitive here because I don't work with windows too much, so I fixed them in place with PVA glue, which is plenty strong and doesn't leave any mess behind. Now, I received some excellent feedback on masking in the comment section of the Chevy video, and you were 100% right. Slapping a huge piece of tape across the window, tracing the contours of the frame with a toothpick, and then carefully following this outline with a fresh hobby blade is an S-tier technique. This was my first attempt, so it isn't the cleanest job ever, but it's super precise, super effective, super quick. And now we can finally start priming and painting. If you watch my videos, you know that I've run out of my favorite black Mr. Surfacer. And if you don't, then what are you even doing? Subscribe, right now. And because I wasn't able to get my hands on a new bottle of black primer, or in other words, I was too lazy to click the Add to Cart button, I had to use what I still have. Alright, let's start by painting the underside and every steel component such as the rear bumper, the flatbed and the wheel rims. A dark grey base coat followed by a very diluted uneven layer of red-brown is one of my favorite combinations when it comes to partially corroded metal. All of this was then covered with a generous coat of chipping fluid because what we're gonna do is basically split one layer of paint into two different effects. Let me explain. So basically the entire model is gonna be sprayed with flat white, but the rusty surfaces will receive just a thin mist, while the body will be completely covered. On the steel details, it's gonna serve as a faint texture, which will be greatly enhanced later with oil paints, and on the body, it will act as a base color for faded aluminum. It took me a while before I started chipping the paint down, and because of that, it has become quite sturdy. But that's actually a pretty good thing in this case, because we can create this really subtle visual texture. And if we want to remove more of the paint, a smaller, stiffer paintbrush will do the job without any issues. Once the surface was dry, I applied a heavy enamel pin wash. It might look weird that I'm applying washes when the model isn't even painted, but it's actually gonna be pretty sweet. You see, I didn't open the bottle of wash because of the chassis, it was actually for the upper surfaces, and this was just a small warm-up. Now, why would I be applying an enamel wash on a white Land Rover when the actual color is gonna be yellow? Well, this is a small experiment that I did in the interior, and it kinda worked pretty well actually. Because it's crystal clear from the reference images that the body is made from aluminum, not steel. The alloy looks heavily faded and has a matte, light gray, almost white color. That's also why I'm applying and blending the wash in a very messy way. My goal isn't to outline the surface details, but to add lots of stains and visual variety. It's a simple concept and it's also very practical for someone who doesn't have any high-end metallic paints, such as me. So again, the model was covered with 2 layers of chipping fluid, and although it might take it a while to dry, I found that having a small fan pointed at the model speeds things up significantly. The yellow color was mixed from these Tamiya paints, but we'll be adjusting it further down the road. You know that situation when there's a dark rusty base coat, then it's smart to spray a thin layer of white before you start applying the actual color, because it helps you build the opacity without creating an overly thick layer that's difficult to chip, right? Well, this is basically the same thing, except we're not gonna chip the paint down to the rusty metal, but a white color, which at the same time helps us achieve nice opacity almost immediately. Well, that might be easy, but what's not easy is the actual chipping. The paint wasn't sturdy or anything, but it's the lack of contrast that made me question the whole thing. But then again, I already tested it in the interior, and that's why it's so awesome to make a small test section of the model if you're not certain about the weathering procedure. The point is, I could definitely make the yellow paint darker, because it would contrast better with the chipping, and it would also look more like the paint on the real car. But that's totally okay, we'll make it work. Pretty much the only area where the chipping is immediately noticeable is the front, especially the hood. But I mean, duh, half of the thing is chipped. I wonder what happened to the real car. I'm sort of imagining an 18-wheeler on the freeway and suddenly the brake hose explodes and brake fluid sprays on the bonnet of this poor Land Rover. Of course, steel components are super fun because the contrast game is very strong here, and it was especially fun to chip the rims that have all these protruding shapes. I was having so much fun with them, I almost wandered off screen. Okay, now it's time for the most treacherous part of the entire process: ditching the decals and making my own stencils. One part of my brain, which likes to stay in the comfort zone, was telling me to use the decals and make them look chipped, while the other was screaming at me to use that Cricut maker which I bought like 3 years ago and used it maybe twice. And none of those cases were related to scale modeling. Basically, I took a picture of the decals, straightened it up in Lightroom, and created a black and white silhouette in Photoshop. The machine did a fairly good job, and the clear transfer tape that came with the cutter is also pretty good. If you know how it goes, you spend more than an hour with masking, and then you get the painting done in like 3 minutes. And removing the mask takes like 3 seconds. Because I sprayed the chipping fluid on top of the mask, not underneath, it crawled up on the edges and left these raised outlines on each letter. But it's no problem to remove them. I also didn't apply any varnishes underneath to protect the previous layer. Chipping the letters doesn't require too much force, and if I managed to introduce some extra chips, I didn't see that as an issue. I took the no varnish game to the next level on this model because it has like 8 decals and none of them were applied on top of gloss varnish. I applied them directly on the flat surface, added a little bit of decal softener, and didn't touch the decal until everything was dry. And look at that, it worked pretty well and there's no silvering. But this wasn't the end of masking. Here's a simple caution sign, but it caused me a lot of headaches. I ended up making a sketch on a piece of paper because I just couldn't figure out how to keep the line spacing consistent and the angle at 45 degrees, but somehow I made it work. And of course, the orange strips were chipped as well. We're gonna introduce as much texture as physically possible to this one. But all of that no varnish game flew right out the window because once I was done, I sealed everything with flat varnish. This is actually quite essential because enamels or oils behave much more predictably on a flat sealed surface compared to raw, unvarnished Tamiya paints. And here's another way to mask things. The tail lights were painted with the rest of the model, and once I was done, the paint was wiped away with Mr. Leveling Thinner. Not perfect, but once I added the clear paints, the result was still not perfect, but it's gonna look pretty good. The most satisfying part of the paint job was definitely removing the windshield masks and seeing how good of a job I did. Okay, it wasn't absolutely spot on, but those few small flaws are easy to hide with pin washes. And besides, the windows are gonna be pretty filthy in the end. So that's the entire model painted and ready for weathering. Honestly, I was looking forward to the weathering so much that I wanted to get the painting out of the way as quickly as possible. So let's get the fun train rolling. After much experimenting, I settled on winter streaking grime as the wash for this model. This is another example where having a test section can help you because when I was painting the interior, I started with wash for German dark yellow, but when I was halfway done, I realized it just doesn't work for the color palette I'm aiming for. This car is covered in crusted grime, and this color is gonna work much better for that. Also, another interesting observation. I didn't like how the model looked once I finished the basic colors. But, of course, I knew that it would change for the better very soon. But the point is, the paint job was messy. When I'm post-shading, I often feel like the model could be left like that and nobody would even notice that it's not finished. But here it was absolutely vital to add contrast around every detail and distinguish every panel from each other. There's actually quite a lot of surface detail on this tiny model. Some bolts or rivets are so small I didn't even notice them during the construction. And lastly, the flat varnish is much smoother than raw Tamiya paint. If you go back and see how I was applying and blending the black wash on the white aluminum and compare it to how the wash behaves now, it's a night and day difference. And even though the model looked messy and all over the place, the wash did a perfect job tidying it up and giving it that signature HDR look. Let's now play with some oil paints, and this is gonna be very simple. When I said that we'll be adjusting the tone of the yellow color, this is it. I was looking at my references and the paint had a noticeable orange or ochre look. Maybe it's a specific Land Rover paint, because after all, the one I found at the start of this video is also ochre. It's a fun and quick method. I mean, it's just a filter after all, but it has some downsides, especially how it tones down the sign and the chipping. But we'll deal with that as well, no problem whatsoever. I'll quickly switch to acrylics and paint a few details. Some of these have to be weathered with the rest of the model, so it's only logical to paint them now, especially the metallic details which are very shiny, but they'll contrast beautifully with the grimy weathering. Painting over each letter takes time, because I was also keeping in mind the chipping and I didn't want to cover it up. It improved the look of the model significantly, and it's also gonna have an impact on the weathering. Then I just base coated the remaining details, such as the rusty fuel cap and the shiny headlights, which are painted with the excellent super chrome lacquer paint from AK, and I also squeezed in the clear parts, as these will be weathered as well. Okay, let's now switch back to oils for a short while and add the rust effects. I just had to apply them as heavy filters on top of that white chipped metal. Faint traces of white work especially well with rust tones, because once you're done, you can't even tell if there's any white paint underneath, but it adds so much texture to the finish. Smaller chips were treated the usual way, a small dot of dark rusty oil and then some careful blending. But applying rust filters over a textured area like this is so much fun, you should definitely try it out. And now we're back to acrylics again, or should I say acrylic markers, because when AK sent me these new markers and I saw rubber black in there, I immediately knew that this is gonna make painting wheels a whole lot easier. Of course, it falls flat when we have to paint the tread pattern, but it's incredible for precise work around the rims. So if you haven't tried them out, you can get them as well as any other paint or thing from AK if you follow the affiliate link down in the video description, and you'll even get a nice discount if you use my sales coupon. Each purchase helps me out. You were probably expecting that now I would switch back to oils, but we're staying with acrylics for a little longer. As I said, the hairspray chipping wasn't the greatest, mainly because it was hardly visible due to the low contrast, but it also lacked a bit of fineness in a few areas. Using it as a map for our paintbrush is pretty sweet because it speeds up the entire process and we can focus on the fun parts, which is a questionable statement because not everyone enjoys chipping, but you know what I mean. We're not creating the effect from scratch, pun intended, but just improving what we already have. Sometimes it's just hard to estimate how much contrast will the two paints have, and by the time you're doing the hairspray chipping, then it's already too late. But now we already know what we're working with, and we can choose the appropriate color. And switching back to oils again, I added some of these larger spots of discoloration which are visible in the reference images. It's an interesting effect, almost like blending rust effects on top of steel chipping. It contrasts beautifully with some of the darker areas of the paint job, and the contrast is gonna be even more exciting once we apply the crusted grime on top of it. The last missing detail was the mirror effect, but I lost my sheet of self-adhesive chrome foil, which was my go-to for the job. But I found my way around the issue and used super chrome from AK. Now we can finally perform the most transformative part of the entire weathering process. The grime deposits were mixed from olive drab and dark gray, and this nasty color is gonna contrast beautifully with the yellow. But it's also gonna work perfectly with the pin wash we chose. Check out how I'm varying the intensity of the paint and how I'm applying it in random places, although there is a barely noticeable pattern. The heaviest accumulations are on the horizontal surfaces. Chipping this layer was extremely satisfying because the results were immediate, and the Land Rover, which until this point looked pretty cheerful, started becoming quite brutal. Like, if you look at the model, you know it means business. When you spot it in the corner of your vision, you just know that this isn't your grandma's Land Rover. This is a Land Rover the cool kids drive to parties. Also, remember how I said the painted letters will impact the behavior of the effect? Well, because it's a different kind of surface than the varnished base coat, the grimy paint sticks to them more, and that's exactly what I saw in the references. I wasn't expecting it, but it was a very welcome, most impressive side effect. We haven't used enamels in a while, so let's change that real quick. Mixing the slimy grime from AK with the winter streaking grime, which I used as a wash, creates a very nice, or should I say nasty color, which works perfectly with the effect. Also, pre-moistening the surface with enamel thinner helps to create much smoother blending. I'm not saying it's a better approach, it's just a different approach for different results. And this whole process is just meant to enhance the previous effect. While the hairspray chipping gave us a gritty, textured and brutal result, this is more subtle. It's something I've done 2 years ago on a rotting Volkswagen Beetle, and there's definitely something about blending large streaks of grime on the sides of an old, neglected car. But it's not all about dark, depressing tones. There are a few spots, especially on the rusty steel components, that are nice and vivid like fresh moss. It's effects like these that enhance the feeling of abandonment tenfold. So that's pretty much the entire paint job finished, and that means we can start putting the model together. And the crane is essential because it will influence the layout of the cargo in the flatbed. The wheels have to be glued straight, and we must make sure that all of them will touch the ground. And lastly, there are these chains that secure the rusty bumper hanging from the crane. I find it easier to secure each link with a bit of extra thin superglue, and even though it wasn't my intention, I couldn't resist adding a little bit of dust on the wheels, as well as the rusty chains. These were finished off with a few selective green washes, again based on the reference images, and the spare wheel in the trunk is probably the most overgrown part of the car. No doubt, because it's laying almost horizontally and probably facing north. I also quickly painted a few plastic canisters which were also inspired by the reference images, especially the transparent water jug which is clearly visible in the photo. I was also able to reuse that large paint bucket that I scratch built a long time ago for my Syrian T72, but the model got destroyed and this bucket was one of the few things I managed to save. It's now gonna live on as a part of this model. The final touch was adding a piece of silver duct tape across the license plate, and once it was properly integrated into the paint job, my mission was over. So there we have it, my friends. This is hands down the tiniest 1/35th scale model I've done so far, and also one of the most involved. If we take the size to workload ratio, there was a ton of work here despite its size. I can definitely see now why car models are usually made in a 1/24th scale. Building a model like this is definitely a different experience, especially when you're done with the assembly, but you cannot even take pictures of it because the sub-assemblies just keep falling apart. Just like with the Chevy truck, I didn't enjoy the construction too much, but the weathering on this one was so much fun. And as I said, AK has just released that Volkswagen Transporter, and they also have the old Unimog, so I'll be probably getting both of those as well at some point. I've also put some extra hours into it so I could give you the finished video sooner, so I hope you liked it. And if you're still watching, thank you so much. I'm going to build a very unique diorama for it, and I'm so stoked because it's gonna combine my facades of old buildings with regular dioramas. I don't want to spoil much more, but it's gonna be really fun, and I hope you'll be here for that. So until then, I want to sincerely thank every single one of you for watching these videos, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be here building these models for a living, and I can't thank you enough for this amazing opportunity. All of this is also possible thanks to my incredible patrons. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription because I post there pretty often, and you'll get updates from my workbench where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos and those stay there forever so you can always get back to them. I also have some extra goodies such as 3D models which you can use for detailing your projects, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on, and last but not least, these high-resolution studio photos which show the model in more detail than video ever could. It will help me a lot, but no pressure. Anyway, cars in 1/35th scale might be small, but we can combine them with pretty much any accessory we have at our disposal in the armor modeling world. And let's just say that we have a lot of those on the market. But I've been narrating this video since I woke up, and it's probably a good time to change from pajamas to something more civil. So until the next video, stay safe, be nice to one another, take care of each other, build your models, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers! Však ja si čítam, čo mám povedať. So when I saw that beauty over there, I knew it was time to... Čo? So much so that when I saw it on... So much so that when I first saw it on my local mountain bikes...